Everyone told Jake Razor Morrison not to get involved. The hardened Hells Angels biker had spent 43 years building walls around his heart, living by the code that emotions were weakness and attachment was a liability. When he found Sarah collapsed on that rain-soaked highway, her wheelchair twisted in the ditch, every instinct told him to keep riding. She was disabled, vulnerable, everything his world had taught him to avoid. But something in her eyes stopped him cold. As days turned into weeks in his rundown garage, she began teaching him things no road or brotherhood ever could: patience, tenderness, the kind of peace that comes from truly caring for another soul. But what happens when a man who spent his entire life running finally finds someone worth staying for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain hammered Jake's leather cut like bullets against armor as he leaned into the curves of Highway 101. His Harley's engine roared beneath him, drowning out everything except the storm and his own restless thoughts. The Hells Angels patch on his back had been earned through blood and loyalty over 2 decades, marking him as an enforcer for the Redwood chapter. At 43, Jake Morrison had seen enough violence to fill several lifetimes, his knuckles scarred from countless fights, his soul hardened by the Brotherhood's unforgiving code. The twisted metal caught his headlight first, a wheelchair mangled and thrown against the guardrail like discarded scrap. Jake's instinct was to throttle past it. Problems on the road meant complications, and complications meant trouble with the law or rival clubs. But then he saw her. Sarah lay crumpled in the shallow ditch, her body still and vulnerable against the muddy embankment. Rain soaked through her clothes, and her face was pale in the harsh glare of his bike's headlight. Every rule he'd learned in 20 years of club life screamed at him to keep riding. The Brotherhood had taught him that stopping for strangers was weakness, that showing compassion made you a target. But something in the set of her jaw, even unconscious, spoke of a strength that reminded him of his grandmother. The old woman who'd raised him after his parents died, who'd shown him kindness before the world taught him cruelty. Jake killed the engine and climbed off his bike, his boots squelching in the mud. She was breathing but barely conscious. Her left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and he could see she'd been thrown from the wheelchair during what looked like an accident. Or maybe something worse. Fresh bruises marked her arms, too symmetrical to be from the fall alone. "Ma'am!" Jake's voice was rougher than he intended, years of shouting over engines and bar fights having worn it raw. "Can you hear me?" Sarah's eyes fluttered open, and Jake felt something shift in his chest. They were grey like storm clouds, but filled with an intelligence that cut through her pain. She studied his face, taking in the beard, the scars, the patches that marked him as dangerous. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Don't call the police." The request surprised him. Most people in her situation would be begging for help, for authorities, for rescue. Instead, she was asking him to keep them away. Jake recognized fear when he saw it, and this woman wasn't afraid of being hurt. She was afraid of being found. Without thinking, Jake shrugged out of his leather jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. The gesture felt foreign to him, this act of protection without expectation of return. He'd spent so many years taking what he wanted, using his size and reputation to intimidate, that gentleness felt like speaking a forgotten language. "My garage isn't far," he found himself saying. "I can get you warm, check those injuries." Sarah's eyes searched his face, looking for deception or ulterior motives. Whatever she saw, there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slightly. Jake carefully lifted her from the ditch, surprised by how light she felt in his arms. Her wheelchair was beyond repair, its frame bent and wheels shattered. The ride to his garage was awkward. Sarah perched sideways on the bike behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist for stability. Jake could feel her trembling, whether from cold, pain, or fear, he couldn't tell. Maybe all three. His garage sat on the outskirts of town, a converted warehouse where he fixed bikes for the club and stored the mechanical remnants of his old life. Before the Hells Angels, before the violence and the reputation, Jake had been his father's son, learning honest work with tools and engines. The space still smelled of motor oil and metal, but it was clean and organized, a refuge from the chaos of his other world. Jake helped Sarah onto an old couch he kept in the office area, then rummaged through a first aid kit. Her injuries weren't life-threatening, but she needed medical attention he couldn't provide. Still, he could clean the cuts and make her comfortable until morning. "What's your name?" he asked, dabbing antiseptic on a gash above her eyebrow. "Sarah," she replied, wincing but not pulling away. "Sarah Chen. Jake Morrison." He paused, then added, "They call me Razor." She almost smiled at that. "Because you're sharp?" "Because I cut people." The honesty surprised him. He usually let people assume what they wanted about his nickname, but Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she studied his hands as he worked, noting how carefully he cleaned her wounds, how gently he wrapped her sprained wrist. "You're being very kind to a stranger." Jake didn't know how to respond to that. Kindness wasn't a word that had been applied to him in years. Sarah woke to the sound of metal against metal, a rhythmic hammering that pulled her from uneasy sleep. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was. The couch beneath her was worn but clean, covered with a heavy blanket that smelled of motor oil and something distinctly masculine. Sunlight streamed through grimy windows, illuminating a space that was part garage, part workshop, and entirely unfamiliar. The medical alert bracelet on her wrist caught the light as she sat up slowly, her body protesting every movement. The small silver band held more information than most people would ever need to know about her. A catalogue of medications and conditions that painted her as fragile in the eyes of the medical establishment. But Sarah had learned long ago that being underestimated could be its own kind of armor. The hammering stopped, and she heard footsteps approaching. Jake appeared in the doorway, his massive frame filling the space between workshop and office. In daylight, he looked even more intimidating than he had the night before. His beard was streaked with grey, and fresh grease stained his hands and forearms. The Hell's Angels patches on his vest caught her attention again, reminding her exactly what kind of man had rescued her. "You're awake," he said, his voice carrying that same rough gentleness from the night before. How are you feeling?" Sarah took inventory of her body. Her leg ached, her wrist was stiff in its bandage, and every muscle felt like she'd been hit by a truck. Which, in a way, she supposed she had been. "Like I've been better," she admitted. "Thank you for helping me." Jake shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Coffee's fresh if you want some. And I found some pain medication in the first aid kit." She watched him pour coffee into a chipped mug, noting how his large hands moved with surprising precision. Everything about this man contradicted itself. The dangerous patches and scarred knuckles spoke of violence, but his actions were gentle, protective. It reminded her of the stray dogs she'd fed as a child, creatures that could bite but chose not to when shown kindness. "Your wheelchair's totaled," Jake said, handing her the coffee. "I called around this morning. There's a medical supply place in Santa Rosa that might have something temporary." Sarah's stomach tightened. Medical supplies meant insurance forms, meant records, meant the possibility of being tracked. "I can't," she said quickly. "I mean, I don't have insurance that would cover it right now." Jake studied her face, and she could see him processing her obvious lie. He was more perceptive than she'd given him credit for. "You running from something, Sarah?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. She'd expected more polite dancing around the subject, the kind of careful probing most people engaged in when they sensed trouble. But Jake seemed to prefer honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. "Someone," she corrected quietly. "I'm running from someone." Jake nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. "Husband. Ex-husband. Legally speaking." She touched her bracelet unconsciously, remembering how Mark had insisted on controlling every aspect of her medical care, using her disability as a way to keep her dependent and isolated. "He has a way of finding me. Not if you don't want to be found." The certainty in Jake's voice surprised her. This wasn't empty reassurance or false comfort. This was a man who understood how to disappear, how to stay hidden from people who meant harm. Sarah found herself wondering what he was hiding from, what kind of past had taught him these skills. "I should go," she said, though the words felt hollow. Where would she go without a wheelchair, without resources, without anywhere safe to run? "I don't want to cause you trouble." Jake's laugh was short and bitter. "Lady, I've been trouble since before you were born. One more problem isn't going to break me." Before Sarah could respond, the rumble of motorcycles filled the air outside. Multiple engines, powerful and loud, the kind of sound that announced the arrival of serious riders. Jake's entire demeanor changed, his casual posture shifting into something more alert, more dangerous. "Stay here," he said, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Whatever you hear, don't come outside." Through the window, Sarah watched as 4 motorcycles pulled into the yard, their riders wearing the same patches as Jake. The men who climbed off the bikes looked like they'd stepped from her worst nightmares about outlaw bikers. Leather chains and attitudes that suggested violence was always an option. The conversation outside was too muffled to make out clearly, but the tone was unmistakably confrontational. Sarah heard Jake's voice, steady and calm, but underneath it she sensed tension. These men weren't here for a social visit. They were here about her. One of the bikers, a tall man with greying hair and cold eyes, gestured toward the garage. Sarah shrank back from the window, her heart racing. She'd brought exactly the kind of trouble into Jake's life that he didn't need. The kind that could destroy whatever fragile peace he'd built for himself in this place. The brothers had left with warnings still hanging in the air like exhaust fumes. Jake returned to the garage with tension radiating from his shoulders, but he said nothing about the conversation outside. Sarah didn't push. She understood the weight of secrets, the necessity of keeping certain truths buried. Instead, she watched him work. Jake had pulled the engine from a 1987 shovelhead, its components spread across his workbench like the organs of some mechanical beast. His father's old toolbox sat open beside him, its contents worn smooth by decades of use. The tools were quality pieces, cared for and maintained, speaking of honest work and family tradition. "That's a beautiful bike," Sarah said, maneuvering closer in the temporary wheelchair Jake had improvised from an old office chair and some casters. The contraption was awkward but functional, allowing her some independence while they figured out what came next. Jake grunted acknowledgement, his attention focused on a particularly stubborn bolt. His hands, despite their size and the scars that marked them, moved with surprising precision around the delicate engine components. "The timing's off," Sarah observed, studying the engine's alignment. "See how the cam's sitting? It's probably throwing your ignition sequence." Jake paused, wrenched halfway to the bolt, and looked at her with new interest. "You know engines?" "My father was a mechanic before he became an engineer. I grew up in his shop." Sarah moved closer, pointing to a specific component. "That bearing's wearing unevenly, too. It'll seize up on you within 1,000 miles if you don't replace it." For the first time since she'd met him, Jake smiled. Not the careful, guarded expression he'd worn around his brotherhood, but something genuine and surprised. "Most people see a Harley engine and think it's all chrome and noise. Most people don't look close enough to see what's really there." Something in her tone made Jake study her face. Sarah Chen was not what she appeared to be at first glance. The disability, the vulnerability he'd witnessed on the highway, those were just surface elements. Underneath was a sharp intelligence and a competence that her circumstances had forced her to hide. "Hand me that timing light," she said, and Jake found himself following her instructions without question. They worked together for the next hour, Sarah's engineering background complementing Jake's mechanical instincts. She could see problems, he felt, while he could implement solutions. Her physical limitations prevented her from executing herself. It was a partnership neither had expected, born from mutual respect rather than pity or obligation. "Why'd you stop?" Jake asked eventually, noting how Sarah's knowledge extended far beyond basic mechanics into advanced engineering principles. "Stop what?" "Working on engines. Being an engineer. Whatever you did before." Sarah's hands stilled on the timing mechanism. The question touched on territory she wasn't ready to explore. Memories of a life systematically dismantled by someone who'd claimed to love her. "It became complicated," she said finally. Jake understood complicated. His own past was littered with choices that had seemed necessary at the time, but looked different in hindsight. The Hells Angels had given him purpose when he'd needed it, family when he'd been alone, but they'd also demanded pieces of his soul he wasn't sure he could reclaim. "This is good work," Sarah said, changing the subject as she examined the engine's internals. You rebuilt this from the ground up. Keeps my hands busy. Keeps my mind off other things. What other things? Jake's expression darkened. Things that don't matter anymore. But Sarah sensed they mattered very much. Whatever had driven Jake to the Brotherhood, whatever violence he'd committed or witnessed, it lived in the tension of his shoulders and the careful distance he maintained from emotional connections. She recognized the signs because she carried her own invisible scars. The brothers who came by, she said carefully. They don't approve of me being here. They don't approve of complications. And I'm a complication. Jake looked at her directly then, his grey eyes holding hers. Yeah, you are. The honesty should have stung, but instead Sarah felt something like relief. No false reassurances, no empty promises. Just truth, difficult and clear. I can leave, she said. I don't want to cause problems for you. Where would you go? The question hung between them, highlighting the impossible situation she faced. No money, no transportation, no safe haven from the man who'd made her life a carefully controlled nightmare. Running had brought her this far, but running required resources she no longer possessed. I don't know, she admitted. Jake returned to his work, but his movements had changed. The mechanical precision remained, but underneath it, Sarah sensed a decision being made. Battle lines being drawn in ways that had nothing to do with engine repair. Engine should run better now, he said eventually, his voice carefully neutral. Want to hear it? The club charter document lay open on Jake's desk like an indictment, its pages yellowed with age and stained with the fingerprints of countless brothers who'd sworn their lives to its principles. Tommy "Snake" Rodriguez, the chapter president, had brought it as both reminder and weapon, the written rules that governed every aspect of Jake's existence within the Hells Angels Brotherhood. Article 7, Snake read aloud, his voice carrying the authority of 25 years in the club. No brother shall jeopardize the safety or security of the chapter through personal entanglements with outsiders who may compromise our operations or bring unwanted attention from law enforcement. Jake kept his expression neutral, though his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd helped write some of these rules, understood their necessity in a world where loyalty was the only currency that mattered and betrayal meant death. But standing in his garage with Sarah's makeshift wheelchair visible in the background, the charter felt less like protection and more like a cage. She's not an entanglement, Jake said carefully. She needed help. Help that's lasted 3 days now. Snake's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes missed nothing. Help that's got you acting different, brother. Soft. The word hung in the air like an accusation. In their world, softness was weakness, and weakness got people killed. Jake had built his reputation on being anything but soft, earning his place as the chapter's enforcer through calculated violence and unwavering loyalty to the Brotherhood above all else. I'm handling it. Are you? Snake gestured toward the office, where Sarah was pretending to read a motorcycle magazine while obviously listening to every word. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like she's handling you. The observation cut deeper than Jake wanted to admit. In 3 days, Sarah had changed something fundamental in his carefully ordered world. Her presence had introduced questions he'd never thought to ask, possibilities he'd trained himself not to consider. The peaceful moments they'd shared working on engines, the way she looked at him without fear or calculation. The simple human connection he'd forgotten existed outside the Brotherhood's rigid hierarchy. The cop's been sniffing around, Snake continued, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone, asking questions about accidents on Highway 101, about missing persons reports. You want to tell me there's no connection? Jake's blood chilled. If law enforcement was already investigating Sarah's disappearance, then her ex-husband had resources and influence that made the situation far more dangerous than a simple domestic dispute. The Brotherhood had survived by staying invisible, by avoiding any attention that might invite scrutiny into their less legal activities. She's running from an abusive ex, Jake said. That's not our problem. It is when she's in your garage. Snake stepped closer, lowering his voice so Sarah couldn't overhear. Look, Razor, I get it. You've been alone a long time, and she's probably grateful for the help. But grateful women are dangerous. They make men think with the wrong head, make them forget where their real loyalties lie. From the office came the soft sound of pages turning, Sarah maintaining her pretense of casual reading, while her future was being decided by men who saw her as nothing more than a liability. Jake wondered what she thought of their conversation, whether she understood that her very existence had become a threat to everything he'd built over the past 20 years. "The charter's clear," Snake said, tapping the document with one finger. "Brotherhood first, always. No exceptions. And if I disagree, then you know what happens next." The threat was implicit but unmistakable. The Hells Angels didn't allow retirement, didn't permit brothers to simply walk away when the obligations became inconvenient. Jake had enforced that rule himself, had visited former members who'd thought they could leave the Brotherhood behind and start fresh somewhere else. None of those visits had ended well. "She goes or you both go," Snake said with finality. "But if you choose her over us, don't expect to live long enough to regret it." Through the office window, Jake could see Sarah's reflection in the glass. Her face was carefully composed, but he caught the slight tremor in her hands as she turned another page. She'd heard enough to understand her situation, enough to know that staying meant signing both their death warrants. Snake rolled up the charter and tucked it under his arm. "You've got 24 hours to decide, brother. After that, the decision gets made for you." The president left without ceremony, his motorcycle roaring to life outside before disappearing into the afternoon traffic. Jake stood alone in his garage, surrounded by the tools and machines that had given his life structure and purpose, feeling the weight of an impossible choice settling on his shoulders. From the office came the quiet sound of Sarah's wheelchair approaching. She appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined, and Jake knew she'd made her own decision about what came next. Sarah's physical therapy equipment lay scattered across Jake's floor like the remnants of a life interrupted. Resistance bands, foam rollers, and adaptive devices that spoke of daily battles fought in silence, victories measured in degrees of motion rather than miles traveled. She'd been attempting to transfer from her makeshift wheelchair to the couch when her strength gave out, sending her crashing to the concrete floor along with the bag of therapeutic tools that had become her lifeline. Jake found her there, struggling to pull herself upright against the couch's edge, her face flushed with pain and embarrassment. Without hesitation, he knelt beside her, his large hands gentle as they assessed her condition. A fresh scrape marked her shoulder where she'd hit the floor, and her carefully wrapped wrist had reopened during the fall. "I heard the crash," he said, his voice carrying none of the judgment she'd learned to expect from others. "Where does it hurt?" "Everywhere," Sarah admitted, the honesty surprising them both. She'd spent so many years minimizing her pain, downplaying her struggles to avoid being seen as burdensome, that acknowledging the full scope of her discomfort felt like a form of rebellion. Jake helped her back onto the couch with movements that spoke of experience caring for the wounded. His touch was careful but confident, the same precision he brought to mechanical work applied to the delicate task of tending human damage. As he cleaned the new scrape on her shoulder, Sarah found herself studying his hands, noting how the scars across his knuckles told their own story of violence and survival. "The accident that did this," she said quietly, gesturing to her legs, "it wasn't really an accident." Jake's movements stilled for a moment before resuming their steady rhythm. He'd suspected as much, had recognized the patterns of deliberate injury beneath the story of automotive mishap. "Your ex-husband?" Mark had been escalating for months, pushing me downstairs, accidentally backing into me with his car, always making it look like my disability made me clumsy. Sarah's voice remained steady, but Jake could see the cost of these memories in the tightness around her eyes. The night he pushed me off the balcony, he called 911 himself, played the devastated husband whose disabled wife had fallen while he was at work. The clinical way she described the assault made Jake's hands tighten involuntarily, though he kept his touch gentle against her injured skin. He'd known violence his entire adult life, had dealt it out and received it in equal measure, but there was something particularly vicious about what had been done to Sarah. The calculated cruelty of using her disability as both weapon and excuse. 3 surgeries, Sarah continued, watching Jake work. Months of rehabilitation that he controlled completely. Every doctor's appointment, every therapy session, every medication. He used my recovery to isolate me from everyone who might have helped. Jake understood isolation, understood how it could be weaponized against the vulnerable. The Hells Angels had taught him similar lessons about control, though their methods were more direct. Cut a man off from his support systems, make him dependent on your approval for survival, and you owned him completely. "What about before?" Jake asked. Before him, Sarah's expression softened with memory. "I was a biomedical engineer, worked on prosthetic design, adaptive technologies for people with disabilities. I had my own lab, my own research grants." She paused, touching one of the resistance bands with something like reverence. "I was trying to revolutionize how we think about human-machine interfaces." The woman Jake was learning to know began to emerge more clearly through her words. Not the victim he'd found on the highway, but someone who'd built a life around helping others reclaim their independence. Someone whose expertise had been systematically dismantled by a man who'd claimed to love her. "He made me quit," Sarah said simply. "Said my work was too demanding, that I needed to focus on my health. By the time I realized what was happening, I'd lost everything. My job, my research, my colleagues. Even my family believed his version of events." Jake finished bandaging her shoulder and sat back on his heels, studying her face. "But you got away. I tried to leave 6 times before this. Each time he found me. Each time the consequences got worse." Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to her ribs, where older injuries had left their mark. "He has connections in law enforcement, friends in the medical community, people who believed his story about the devoted husband caring for his unstable wife." The picture she painted was one of systematic abuse enabled by social structures that should have protected her. Jake recognized the isolation tactics, the way powerful men could manipulate systems to maintain control over those they claimed to care for. He'd seen it in the Brotherhood too, though their methods were more honest in their brutality. "This time feels different," Sarah said, meeting his eyes. "Because of you." Jake felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of defenses he'd maintained for decades. Here was someone who understood what it meant to be trapped by loyalty and fear, who'd found the courage to break free despite impossible odds. Sarah's adaptive kitchen tools transformed Jake's sparse cooking area into something resembling a functional workspace. Jar openers designed for limited grip strength, cutting boards with raised edges to prevent spills, utensils with built-up handles that accommodated her reduced dexterity. Each device represented years of learning to navigate a world designed for bodies that worked differently than hers. Engineering solutions born from necessity and stubborn independence. "You don't have to do this," Jake said. Watching her maneuver around the small kitchen area he'd carved out in one corner of the garage. His own relationship with cooking extended little beyond opening cans and heating frozen meals. Bachelor habits reinforced by decades of eating at roadhouse diners and club gatherings. "I need to do this," Sarah replied, her tone carrying gentle but unmistakable determination. "I've been dependent on others for too long. Besides, when's the last time you had a real meal?" Jake couldn't remember. Food had become fuel, something to consume quickly between mechanical projects and club obligations. But watching Sarah work, seeing how she'd adapted every motion to work around her limitations while refusing to accept them as defeat, he began to understand that cooking represented something far more significant than mere sustenance. She moved with practiced efficiency, compensating for her wheelchair's height limitations by organizing ingredients within easy reach, using her adaptive tools to accomplish tasks that would have been simple for someone else, but required careful planning and modified technique for her. There was grace in her movements, a kind of choreographed problem-solving that spoke of intelligence applied to the fundamental challenge of daily survival. "Hand me that cutting board," she said, and Jake found himself following her instructions without question, becoming an extension of her adaptive system. "The trick is preparation. If you think through each step beforehand, you can accomplish almost anything." The lesson extended beyond cooking, and they both knew it. Sarah's entire life had become an exercise in thinking through each step, in finding workarounds for a world that assumed physical capabilities she no longer possessed. But instead of bitterness, she'd developed a kind of creative resilience that impressed Jake more than any display of brute strength he'd witnessed in the Brotherhood. "My grandmother used to cook like this," Jake said, watching Sarah season a simple pasta sauce with ingredients she'd somehow coaxed from his bare pantry. "Everything from scratch, nothing wasted." "Tell me about her." The request surprised him. Jake rarely spoke about his past, about the woman who'd raised him after his parents died in a motorcycle accident when he was 12. But something about the domestic intimacy of the moment, the peaceful rhythm of Sarah's movements, made the memories feel safe to share. "Maria Morrison, toughest woman I ever knew, and that's saying something in my line of work." Jake leaned against the counter, allowing himself to remember. "She took me in when nobody else would, fed me stories about my father along with her cooking, taught me that real strength comes from taking care of people, not hurting them." Sarah paused in her stirring, sensing the weight of what he'd shared. What happened to her? Cancer. Fought it for 3 years before it finally won. Jake's voice carried old grief, carefully buried but never fully healed. "I was 19, angry at everything, looking for someone to blame. That's when I found the Brotherhood." The timing explained much about Jake's trajectory, how grief and rage had led him down a path that gradually separated him from the values his grandmother had tried to instill. Sarah understood the appeal of belonging to something larger than yourself when the world felt hostile and uncertain. "She would have liked this," Jake said, gesturing to the kitchen scene unfolding around them. "You're cooking, making a home out of nothing." "Is that what I'm doing?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. But the answer was evident in the way Jake had unconsciously relaxed, how his posture had shifted from the defensive alertness he wore like armor to something approaching contentment. "Smells incredible," he said instead of answering directly. Sarah smiled, understanding his deflection. Simple ingredients properly prepared. Sometimes the most basic things are the most satisfying. They ate together as evening shadows lengthened across the garage floor, sharing a meal that tasted like possibilities neither had dared to imagine. The pasta was perfectly cooked, the sauce rich with herbs and patience. But more than that, it represented something Jake had forgotten existed. Peace. Companionship without agenda. The simple pleasure of caring for someone and being cared for in return. "Thank you," Jake said as they finished eating, his words encompassing far more than gratitude for the meal. "Thank you for letting me," Sarah replied, understanding exactly what he meant. Outside, the first rumble of motorcycle engines announced the evening patrol of his brothers. But for the first time in years, Jake didn't feel the automatic urge to join them. The phone rang at 3 a.m, its shrill tone cutting through the peaceful silence that had settled over the garage. Sarah jerked awake on the couch, her heart hammering, as she recognized the ringtone she'd programmed for only one contact. Jake appeared from the back room instantly, his body already alert, despite having been asleep moments before. "Don't answer it," he said, but Sarah was already reaching for the device with trembling fingers. "If I don't, he'll know something's wrong," she whispered, then pressed the answer button. "Hello, Mark." Her ex-husband's voice filled the space between them, smooth and controlled, in the way that had once fooled her into thinking it meant safety. "Sarah, darling, you've been very difficult to find." Jake moved closer, close enough to hear both sides of the conversation. Mark's tone carried the false warmth of a man accustomed to getting his way through manipulation rather than force, though Sarah knew the violence that lurked beneath his civilized exterior. "I don't know what you mean," Sarah said, her voice steadier than Jake had expected. "I'm at the rehabilitation facility you suggested. The one in Eureka." "Really?" "Because I called there yesterday. Imagine my surprise when they told me you'd never checked in." The warmth leached out of Mark's voice, replaced by something colder and infinitely more dangerous. "You've been a very naughty girl, Sarah, making me worry like this." Jake's hands clenched into fists as he listened to the casual condescension. The way Mark spoke to Sarah like she was a misbehaving child rather than an adult making her own choices. It was a control tactic Jake recognized, designed to reinforce helplessness and dependency. "I'm getting the help I need," Sarah said carefully. "That's what matters. The help you need is at home with your husband who loves you, who's been worried sick about your safety." Mark's voice shifted again, taking on the reasonable tone of a concerned spouse. "You know how vulnerable you are out there alone. Anything could happen to you." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah's free hand gripped the arm of the couch, her knuckles white with tension. Jake wanted to rip the phone away, to tell this bastard exactly what he thought of men who preyed on vulnerable women, but he forced himself to stay silent. This was Sarah's battle to fight. "I'm fine, Mark, really. Are you? Because I have reason to believe you've been keeping company with some very dangerous people. Criminals, Sarah. The kind of men who would take advantage of a woman in your condition." Jake's blood chilled. Somehow, Mark had tracked Sarah to the garage, had identified Jake's connection to the Hells Angels. The implications were staggering. If Mark had that kind of investigative capability, then he was far more than an abusive ex-husband. He had resources, connections, the kind of reach that made him genuinely dangerous. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said, but her eyes met Jake's, confirming that she understood the gravity of what Mark was implying. "A certain Jake Morrison. Goes by Razor, member of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. Multiple arrests for assault, suspected in several unsolved cases of aggravated battery." Mark's voice carried the satisfaction of a man playing his winning hand. "Really, Sarah? Is this the kind of man you think can protect you?" The police report from Sarah's original accident materialized in Jake's mind, though he'd never seen it. Mark would have crafted it carefully, documenting her fall from the balcony as an accident, establishing a pattern of instability that would discredit any future claims of abuse. The man was thorough, methodical, someone who planned several moves ahead. "Jake's been kind to me," Sarah said quietly. "More than I can say for some people." "Kind." Mark's laugh was genuinely amused. "Oh, darling. Men like that are never kind without expecting something in return. You're being used, Sarah, probably in ways you don't even realize yet." Jake watched Sarah's face crumple slightly at the insinuation, saw how Mark's words found their mark in her deepest insecurities. This was psychological warfare waged by an expert, designed to undermine her confidence in her own judgment and her trust in anyone who might help her. "I'm coming to get you," Mark continued. "I've already spoken to the local authorities about your condition, your history of erratic behavior since the accident. They're very concerned about your welfare, especially given your association with known criminals. Mark, please, I'll be there tomorrow, Sarah, and when I arrive, we're going home, together, like a family should be." The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at the phone with an expression of absolute despair. Jake had heard enough to understand that they were facing an enemy far more sophisticated and dangerous than either had imagined. Jake's emergency cash stash had been hidden beneath a false bottom in his toolbox for 15 years, who crisp hundreds and twenties that represented his insurance against the kind of trouble that couldn't be solved with fists or brotherhood loyalty. He'd never imagined using it to help someone else disappear. But as he counted out enough money to keep them moving for weeks, he realized his priorities had shifted in ways that would have been unthinkable a week ago. "We leave in 10 minutes, he told Sarah, who was already packing her few belongings into a duffel bag he'd found. Her movements were quick and efficient, speaking of someone who'd learned to travel light and move fast when survival depended on speed. "Where are we going?" "North. I know a place." Jake secured the cash in his jacket pocket alongside his pistol, both tools of a trade he'd hoped to leave behind. "My buddy Tommy runs a cabin in the mountains. Off the grid, no cell service, no way to track us there." Sarah nodded, understanding that questions about specifics could wait until they were safely away from Mark's reach. Jake had proven himself trustworthy in ways that mattered more than detailed explanations, and right now, trust was the only currency that counted. The ride preparation took on ritual significance as Jake checked his Harley with the thoroughness of someone whose life had often depended on mechanical reliability. Tire pressure, fluid levels, brake response, all tested and verified while Sarah watched from her makeshift wheelchair. He'd fashioned a passenger setup that would accommodate her disability, padding and support systems that spoke of his growing understanding of her needs. "I've never been on a motorcycle," Sarah admitted, as Jake helped her onto the bike behind him. "Trust me," he said simply, and she realized that she did, completely and without reservation, in a way that surprised them both. The first miles were tentative, Sarah learning to move with the bike rather than against it, Jake adjusting his riding style to accommodate her unfamiliarity with the physics of two-wheeled travel. But as they left the city limits behind and entered the winding mountain roads, something magical began to happen. Sarah had spent years in wheelchairs and hospital beds, her world reduced to the narrow confines of controlled environments and measured movements. But on the back of Jake's Harley, with the wind rushing past and the landscape flowing by in an endless stream of possibility, she experienced freedom in its purest form. Her arms tightened around Jake's waist, not from fear, but from exhilaration, from the intoxicating sensation of movement without barriers. Jake felt her relaxation, the way her body stopped fighting the bike's rhythm and began to embrace it. Through his mirrors, he caught glimpses of her face, eyes wide with wonder, as they carved through curves that offered stunning views of valleys and forests stretching to the horizon. For the first time since he'd found her on that rain-soaked highway, Sarah looked genuinely happy. They stopped at a roadside diner after 2 hours of riding, both needing fuel and Jake wanting to check if they'd been followed. The place was a relic from another era, all chrome and vinyl and the kind of honest food that came without pretension. Sarah slid into a booth, while Jake kept watch through the windows, his eyes scanning for any vehicle that might have tracked them from the city. "This is incredible," Sarah said, her cheeks flushed from wind and excitement. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to just go somewhere, to move without planning every detail, every accommodation." Jake understood. The Brotherhood had given him freedom of a sort, but it came with obligations and territories, invisible boundaries that limited how far he could roam. This journey felt different, purposeful, in a way that had nothing to do with club business or territorial disputes. "There's more," he promised, settling into the booth across from her. "The cabin's another 3 hours north, but the roads get better. Fewer people, more views. Tell me about this friend of yours." Danny Reeves did 2 tours in Afghanistan before he decided he'd had enough of other people's wars. Bought the cabin with his disability settlement, been living off the grid ever since. Jake sipped his coffee, remembering. "Good man. Keeps to himself. Doesn't ask questions about why people need to disappear for a while." Sarah nodded, recognizing the description of someone who understood the necessity of sanctuary, of places where damaged people could heal without judgment or interference. "And he'll help us?" "He'll help me." "Which means he'll help you." The simplicity of Jake's loyalty struck Sarah with unexpected force. In her marriage, help had always come with conditions, strings attached that could be pulled to create obligation and control. But Jake's offer of protection carried no hidden agenda, no expectation of payment beyond the simple human connection they'd built together. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, both understanding that they were crossing more than geographical boundaries on this journey north. The cabin's guest book sat open on Danny Reeves's kitchen table, its pages filled with signatures and brief messages from people who'd found refuge in this remote sanctuary over the years. Combat veterans seeking peace, abuse survivors rebuilding their lives, former inmates trying to integrate back into society. Each entry told a story of brokenness and healing, of finding hope in the most unexpected places. "Read this one," Danny said, pointing to an entry from 3 months earlier. "Woman came here after escaping human trafficking. Stayed 2 weeks, learned to fish, said it was the first time in 5 years she'd felt safe enough to sleep through the night." Sarah ran her finger along the handwritten words, recognizing the careful script of someone who'd fought to reclaim their voice. The message was simple. "Thank you for showing me that sanctuary exists. I remember now what peace feels like." Danny Reeves was not what Sarah had expected from Jake's description. The former soldier was compact and wiry, his left arm ending at the elbow, a prosthetic attachment resting against the cabin wall like a tool to be used when needed rather than a permanent fixture. His disability was matter-of-fact rather than defining, integrated into his daily life with the same practical acceptance Sarah had learned to apply to her own limitations. IED outside Kabul, Danny explained, noticing her glance at his missing limb. Took my arm and half my hearing, but gave me perspective on what really matters. Turns out it wasn't what I thought. The cabin itself was a masterpiece of accessible design. Modifications made not from legal requirements, but from genuine understanding of what independence looked like for people with disabilities. Ramps instead of steps, lowered counters in the kitchen, a bathroom designed for wheelchair access. Everything functional and beautiful, proving that accommodation and aesthetics could coexist. Jake called ahead, Danny said, showing Sarah to the main bedroom while Jake unloaded their few belongings. Told me you might need some special considerations. Hope this works. The room had been transformed into something resembling a rehabilitation suite, complete with parallel bars Jake could help her use for physical therapy, a hospital bed that could be adjusted for comfort, and adaptive equipment that would allow her to maintain her independence. The thoughtfulness of the preparations brought tears to Sarah's eyes. You didn't have to do all this, she said. Course I did. That's what this place is for. Danny's tone brooked no argument. Besides, Jake's good people helped me out of a tight spot a few years back when some government types were asking too many questions about my living arrangements. Jake returned from securing the motorcycle, his eyes taking in the room's modifications with obvious gratitude. Sarah realized this was probably the first time he'd asked anyone for help, the first time he'd allowed himself to be vulnerable enough to need assistance protecting someone else. There's something else, Danny said, leading them to the cabin's back porch. Jake mentioned you might need to stay invisible for a while. This should help. The view from the porch was breathtaking, mountains stretching to the horizon in waves of green and granite, not another human structure visible anywhere. But more than beautiful, it was completely isolated, accessible only by a single dirt road that could be watched and defended if necessary. Nearest neighbors 15 miles down the mountain, Danny explained. No cell towers, no internet, no way for anyone to track you here unless they already know where to look. And if they do know, well, we'll see them coming long before they see us. Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. True safety. Not the false security Mark had offered through control and isolation, but genuine sanctuary born from the kindness of strangers who understood what it meant to need refuge from a hostile world. How long can we stay? Jake asked. Long as you need, Danny replied. But I'm guessing you're not planning to hide forever. The observation was accurate. Sarah could see it in Jake's posture, the way he studied the approaches to the cabin with tactical awareness, rather than the relaxation of someone planning an extended retreat. This was a temporary haven, a place to regroup and plan rather than a permanent escape. He'll keep coming, Sarah said quietly. Mark doesn't give up. He sees me as property he owns, and he'll never stop trying to reclaim what he thinks belongs to him. Then we make sure he can't, Jake said with quiet determination. Danny nodded approvingly. Sometimes the only way to stop a predator is to become more dangerous than they are. Question is, how far are you willing to go? Sarah looked out at the endless mountains, feeling the peace of this place settle into her bones, while understanding that peace was something that had to be fought for and defended. She thought about the other names in the guest book, people who'd found the courage to reclaim their lives despite overwhelming odds. As far as it takes, she said finally. The private investigator's badge gleamed in the afternoon sunlight as Marcus Webb climbed out of his black SUV, his expensive suit incongruous against the rough mountain setting. Sarah's ex-husband had spared no expense in tracking them down, hiring someone with the resources and connections to penetrate even Danny's carefully constructed isolation. Webb moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to finding people who didn't want to be found. Jake watched through binoculars from the cabin's concealed observation post, cataloguing details that would matter in the confrontation to come. Webb was armed, the bulge beneath his jacket unmistakable to someone trained to spot such things. But more concerning was his casual approach to the cabin, The way he moved, like a man who knew exactly what he'd find and had prepared accordingly. "Sarah Chen," Webb called out, his voice carrying easily across the mountain air. "I know you're in there. Your husband is very worried about you." Danny appeared on the porch, his missing arm prominently displayed as he leaned against the railing with studied casualness. To Webb, he would look like exactly what he appeared to be, a disabled veteran living off the grid, probably harboring anti-government sentiments, but ultimately harmless. "Don't know any Sarah," Danny said, his tone friendly but cautious. "You're trespassing on private property." Webb smiled, producing a leather wallet that displayed his credentials alongside several official-looking documents. "Marcus Webb, licensed private investigator. I'm working with local law enforcement on a missing persons case. Woman named Sarah Chen, disabled, considered vulnerable and possibly in the company of dangerous individuals." The description was carefully crafted. Sarah realized from her hiding place in the cabin's interior, Webb was painting her as a victim of circumstance rather than choice, someone whose disability made her incapable of making rational decisions about her own safety. It was Mark's narrative perfectly executed, designed to enlist sympathy and cooperation from well-meaning strangers. "Like I said, don't know her," Danny repeated, "but you're welcome to look around if you've got a warrant." "I don't need a warrant for a welfare check," Webb replied, his pleasant demeanor never slipping. "Especially when we have reason to believe she's being held against her will by members of a criminal organization." Jake's jaw tightened at the implication. Webb was suggesting kidnapping, painting Jake as the predator and Sarah as his victim. It was a clever inversion of the truth, one that would resonate with law enforcement and social services who were predisposed to see disabled women as vulnerable and motorcycle clubs as inherently dangerous. "That's a serious accusation," Danny said. "You got any proof of that?" Webb produced a tablet, its screen displaying what appeared to be security footage from Jake's garage. The images showed Sarah in her makeshift wheelchair, Jake moving around her with his intimidating bulk, the scene carefully edited to remove context and make their interactions appear coercive rather than caring. This footage was taken 3 days ago at the garage of one Jake Morrison, also known as Razor, a known associate of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. Webb's voice carried the authority of documented fact. "As you can see, Mrs. Chen appears distressed and confined against her will." Sarah wanted to scream at the manipulation, the way her moments of pain and frustration had been recontextualized to support Mark's narrative. But she forced herself to remain silent, understanding that revealing her presence would only confirm Webb's story and give him legal justification for whatever came next. "Interesting," Danny said, studying the tablet with apparent curiosity, "but I still don't see how that concerns me. Because this morning we tracked Morrison's motorcycle to this location. GPS data from his phone puts him here approximately 6 hours ago." Webb's smile turned predatory. "Now, I can call in local law enforcement and have them conduct a thorough search of these premises. Or you can save us all some time and produce Mrs. Chen voluntarily." The threat was clear: cooperation or consequences. Danny appeared to consider his options, weighing the costs of continued resistance against the benefits of compliance. Sarah held her breath, wondering if their sanctuary was about to become a trap. "Tell you what," Danny said finally. "Why don't you call those local boys you mentioned? I'd like to hear their take on your authority to search private property without probable cause." Webb's expression flickered with annoyance at Danny's refusal to be intimidated. "Mr. Reeves, isn't it? Daniel Reeves, discharged from the army under circumstances that weren't entirely honorable? I'd think a man in your position would want to avoid law enforcement scrutiny." The personal attack revealed how thoroughly Webb had researched everyone connected to Sarah's disappearance. Mark's resources ran deeper than any of them had imagined, extending into military records and personal histories that should have been confidential. "My discharge is my business," Danny replied evenly. "And my property rights don't change based on your opinion of my service record." Jake's military discharge papers lay spread across Danny's kitchen table like evidence in a trial. Documents he'd kept buried for 20 years, finally brought to light. The pages told a story Sarah had never imagined. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison, 75th Ranger Regiment, 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and a service record that spoke of a man who'd been everything the Hells Angels had trained out of him. Delta Force, Danny said quietly, reading over Jake's shoulder. No wonder you could disappear so completely into the Brotherhood. They never knew what they really had. Sarah studied the discharge documents with growing amazement. The man she'd come to know as a gentle protector had once been among the military's most elite warriors, trained in skills that made his current situation with Webb and Mark far more complex than she'd understood. Jake had been hiding not just from his past, but from capabilities that could solve their problems in ways that would destroy his soul. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying hurt alongside curiosity. "Because that man died in Afghanistan," Jake replied, his tone flat and final. "The things I did over there, the missions that never made it into any official record, they turned me into something I didn't recognize. When I came home, I buried that version of myself as deep as I could. The helicopter crash that had ended his military career was described in clinical terms in the medical reports. But Sarah could read between the lines. Traumatic brain injury, multiple fractures, months of rehabilitation that had left him physically whole but psychologically shattered. The Hells Angels had offered him a different kind of brotherhood, one that didn't require him to be a hero or make impossible moral choices. "Webb's not going away," Danny said, breaking the heavy silence. "And Mark's not going to stop sending people like him. This isn't going to end with us hiding in the mountains." Jake's hands clenched on the table's edge, his knuckles white with tension. Sarah could see the war being fought behind his eyes, the conflict between the man he'd been trained to be and the man he'd chosen to become. The Delta Force operator could end this threat permanently, could make Webb and Mark disappear in ways that would never be traced back to them. But that path led to a darkness Jake had spent 20 years trying to escape. "There's another way," Sarah said suddenly, her engineering mind finding patterns in the chaos of their situation. "Mark's strength is his respectability, his connections, the way he manipulates systems to maintain control. But every system has vulnerabilities." She moved to Danny's laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the confidence of someone returning to familiar territory. The skills Mark had forced her to abandon were still there, dormant but not destroyed, waiting for the right moment to resurface. "What are you doing?" Jake asked. "Research. Mark's not invulnerable, he just wants everyone to think he is." Sarah's screen filled with databases and public records, her security clearances from her previous life still active despite years of disuse. "Every abuser leaves a trail. They can't help themselves." Jake watched her work, seeing yet another facet of the woman he'd rescued from that rain-soaked highway. This wasn't the broken victim Mark had tried to create, but the brilliant engineer who'd existed before systematic abuse had buried her capabilities beneath layers of imposed helplessness. "There," Sarah said, pointing to a financial record that had taken her 20 minutes to uncover. "Mark's been billing his private investigation services to a shell company that's connected to 3 other domestic abuse cases, all women who voluntarily returned to their husbands after being found by investigators exactly like Webb. The pattern was clear once illuminated. Mark wasn't just an abusive husband, but part of a network that specialized in retrieving women who'd tried to escape controlling relationships. The legal system wasn't being manipulated accidentally, but systematically corrupted by men with resources and connections who saw their wives as property to be recovered. "This changes everything," Danny said, understanding the implications immediately. "If we can prove he's part of an organized network, we can destroy him," Jake finished, his voice carrying a cold satisfaction that reminded Sarah of the soldier he'd once been. Not with violence, but with truth. Make him face consequences he can't buy or intimidate his way out of. Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since before her marriage. Power. Not the false power Mark had offered through dependency and control, but real agency, born from her own capabilities and the support of people who believed in her strength rather than her weakness. It won't be easy, she warned. Mark has resources, connections, people who owe him favors. Exposing him means exposing ourselves to retaliation. Jake studied her face, seeing the determination that had carried her through years of abuse and the engineering brilliance that could unravel even sophisticated deception. The choice before him wasn't between violence and passivity, but between the darkness of his past and the possibility of a future built on something better. Then we'd better make sure we do it right the first time, he said. The hidden camera equipment Danny produced from his storage shed looked like surplus from a spy thriller. Miniature recording devices and wireless transmitters that spoke of his own complicated relationship with surveillance and security. Each piece was military grade, the kind of gear that cost serious money and required specialized knowledge to operate effectively. Gift from some old contacts who felt bad about how my discharge went down, Danny explained, setting up the equipment on his kitchen table. Figured someday I might need to document something important. Never thought it would be this. Sarah's laptop displayed a complex web of financial connections she'd spent the past 12 hours unraveling, following digital breadcrumbs through shell companies and holding corporations that painted a picture of systematic abuse disguised as legitimate business. Mark's network was larger than any of them had imagined, extending across 3 states and involving dozens of women who'd been recovered by private investigators like Webb. Jennifer Martinez returned to her husband after a 6-month disappearance, Sarah read from her screen. Rebecca Thompson, found after 3 weeks and voluntarily reunited with her family. Lisa Chang, located and convinced to return home for medical treatment. The list went on, each entry representing a life reclaimed by force and legal manipulation. Jake studied the camera equipment with professional interest, his military training making him comfortable with technology that would have intimidated most civilians. What's the plan? We get them on record, Sarah said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd found solid ground after years of uncertainty. Webb's still in town, probably reporting back to Mark about the failed search. If we can get him talking about the network, admitting to the systematic nature of what they're doing, we'll have evidence that even Mark's connections can't suppress. Danny nodded approvingly. What do you need from me? Bait, Sarah said simply. Call Webb. Tell him you've reconsidered. Say you found something that might help his search, but you want to meet somewhere private to discuss it. Somewhere we can record everything. The plan was elegantly simple, relying on Webb's arrogance and Mark's systematic approach to abuse recovery. Men like them couldn't resist explaining their success, couldn't help bragging about their methods when they thought they were among allies. Sarah's engineering background had taught her that the most complex systems often failed at their simplest points. Jake's old contacts from his Delta Force days provided additional resources, encrypted communication channels, and secure data storage that would keep their evidence safe from the kind of legal challenges Mark's lawyers might mount. It felt strange to be using skills he'd tried to forget, but for the first time in 20 years, those capabilities were being applied to protection rather than destruction. There's something else, Sarah said, pulling up another screen on her laptop. I've been in contact with some of the other women on Mark's list. Jennifer Martinez agreed to go on record about what really happened during her voluntary return. The recorded testimony was devastating. Jennifer described being tracked down by Webb after escaping an abusive marriage. How she'd been presented with falsified medical reports claiming she was mentally incompetent. How the legal system had been manipulated to force her return to a man who'd nearly killed her. Her story was Sarah's story, replicated across dozens of cases with systematic precision. They're not just individual abusers, Sarah explained. They're an organized network that specializes in legal kidnapping. They use the system's bias against women, especially disabled women, to reclaim what they see as their property. Jake felt a cold rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him through the worst missions of his military career. But this time the anger was clean, focused on protecting rather than destroying. Sarah had given him something he'd never had before, a righteous cause that aligned with his deepest values. How many others are willing to come forward? Danny asked. 6 so far, with more considering it. But they're scared, and they have good reason to be. Mark's network has resources we're only beginning to understand. Sarah's expression hardened with determination. That's why we need Webb on tape admitting to the organized nature of what they're doing. Individual testimony can be discredited, but a confession from one of their own operatives will be impossible to explain away. The meeting was set for the next evening at an abandoned ranger station 15 miles from Danny's cabin. Webb had agreed eagerly, apparently convinced that Danny's change of heart meant Sarah's capture was imminent. He had no way of knowing that he was walking into a trap designed by people who understood both technology and the psychology of predators. "One shot," Jake said, checking the camera equipment one final time. "If this doesn't work, if Webb gets suspicious or Mark figures out what we're doing, we'll be facing resources we can't match." "It'll work," Sarah said with quiet confidence. "Because they think they're smarter than we are. They think disability makes me helpless and your criminal record makes you stupid. They can't imagine that we might be more dangerous than they are." Sarah's testimony recording device was no larger than a button hidden beneath her jacket collar where Webb would never think to look. Her voice had become her weapon, the same voice Mark had systematically silenced over years of calculated abuse. Tonight, she would use it to destroy the network that had reclaimed so many women like herself. The abandoned ranger station sat in a clearing surrounded by pine trees, its windows dark and its parking area empty except for Webb's black SUV. Danny had arrived first, positioning himself as agreed, while Jake remained hidden in the tree line with backup recording equipment and a clear line of sight to the meeting location. "Mr. Reeves," Webb called out as Danny approached, his expensive suit looking even more out of place in the wilderness setting. "I appreciate you reconsidering your position." "Found something that might interest you," Danny replied, maintaining the role of reluctant ally they'd rehearsed. "But I want to understand exactly what I'm getting myself into before I hand over anything useful." Webb smiled, the expression of a predator who thought he'd finally cornered his prey. "What would you like to know?" "This woman, Sarah Chen. What makes her so important that you'd track her all the way up here? And don't give me the worried husband story. I've seen enough of those to know the difference." The private investigator studied Danny carefully, calculating how much truth he could afford to reveal. Sarah held her breath, knowing that everything depended on Webb's arrogance overcoming his caution. "Mrs. Chen represents a significant investment," Webb said finally. "Her husband has spent considerable resources ensuring her care and protection. When someone like that goes missing, it reflects poorly on our ability to provide security for our clients." "Clients, plural," Danny pressed. "How many husbands are you working for exactly?" Webb's laugh was genuinely amused. "Mr. Reeves, you'd be surprised how many successful men find themselves dealing with unstable wives who don't appreciate the care and protection they're provided. It's become something of a specialty for our organization." Sarah felt her heart racing as Webb began to reveal the scope of their operation. This was exactly what they needed, a confession that tied individual cases to an organized network with systematic methods. "What kind of organization are we talking about?" Danny asked, playing the role of someone considering joining their network. "Think of us as a specialized recovery service," Webb explained, warming to his subject. "We work with medical professionals, legal experts, private investigators, even law enforcement when necessary. The goal is always the same: return these women to their families where they can receive proper care. And if they don't want to be returned?" Webb's expression hardened slightly. Women in Mrs. Chen's condition often lack the capacity to make rational decisions about their own welfare. That's why they have husbands to make those decisions for them. The casual dismissal of women's autonomy made Sarah's hands clench into fists. This was the ideology that had justified years of systematic abuse, the belief that disability equated to incompetence and marriage equated to ownership. "How do you convince them to cooperate?" Danny asked. "Usually we don't have to. Once we explain the legal realities of their situation, most see reason. Medical documentation of instability, financial dependence, lack of resources for independent living. It all adds up to a compelling case for guardianship transfer. Sarah realized she was listening to the blueprint for legal kidnapping, a system that weaponized disability and economic dependence to trap women in abusive relationships. Webb was describing her own experience with chilling precision, the way Mark had systematically eliminated her independence and used her disability as justification for control. And the ones who don't see reason? Webb shrugged. There are always consequences for poor decision-making. Women who associate with criminals, for instance, often find themselves facing serious legal complications. Drug possession, conspiracy charges, parole violations for their criminal associates. Amazing how quickly perspective changes when federal prison becomes a real possibility. Danny nodded, as if impressed by the thoroughness of their methods. Sounds like you've got all the angles covered. We have to. Our clients expect results, and they're willing to pay for expertise. Webb's voice carried the satisfaction of a man proud of his professional accomplishments. Mark Chen, for instance, has been extremely generous in his compensation for Mrs. Chen's recovery. He understands that quality work requires quality resources. Sarah felt a surge of triumph. Webb had just connected Mark directly to the organized network, provided evidence of financial payment for illegal services, and detailed methods that constituted conspiracy to commit kidnapping and extortion. Speaking of Mrs. Chen, Webb continued, I believe you mentioned finding something that might help locate her. Danny reached into his jacket pocket, producing a small device that looked like a GPS tracker. Found this attached to Morrison's motorcycle. Figured you might want to know where he's been. Webb leaned forward eagerly, and Sarah knew they had him completely. Jake's Hells Angels resignation letter sat on Snake Rodriguez's desk like a declaration of war, its simple words carrying the weight of 20 years of brotherhood and loyalty. The chapter meeting room felt smaller than usual, filled with faces Jake had fought beside, bled with, and called family when he'd had nothing else in the world. You sure about this, Razor? Snake asked, his weathered hands folding the letter with deliberate care. 20 years in the Brotherhood, and you're walking away for some woman you've known a week. Jake stood before his assembled brothers, feeling the weight of their judgment, but no longer caring about their approval. Sarah waited outside in Danny's truck, giving him the space to handle this final confrontation with the life he was choosing to leave behind. The evidence they'd gathered against Webb and Mark's network was already in the hands of federal investigators, but this moment was personal. She's not just some woman, Jake replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. She's the reason I remember who I used to be before all this. Murmurs rippled through the assembled bikers. Some angry, some confused, all struggling to understand how one of their most reliable enforcers could abandon everything for a civilian. The Hells Angels charter hanging on the wall seemed to mock Jake's decision, its rules and obligations suddenly feeling like chains rather than structure. You think love's gonna keep you warm when the world turns cold? Asked Tommy Wrench Sullivan, one of Jake's oldest friends in the club. You think some disabled girl's gonna have your back when things get ugly? The casual dismissal of Sarah's strength made Jake's hands clench, but he forced himself to remain calm. These men didn't understand what he'd learned in the past week, how real strength looked different than the violence they celebrated. They couldn't comprehend that vulnerability could be its own form of courage. She's already had my back, Jake said simply. More than any of you ever did. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from their bikes, challenging the very foundation of brotherhood loyalty they'd all sworn to uphold. Snake's expression darkened at the implication that the club had somehow failed one of its own. We gave you purpose when you had nothing, Snake said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd led desperate men through desperate times. We gave you family when you were alone, work when you needed money, respect when the world saw you as just another broken soldier. Jake couldn't deny the truth in Snake's words. The Hells Angels had provided structure and belonging when he'd returned from Afghanistan, shattered and directionless. They'd given him an identity beyond his military failures, a place where his capacity for violence was valued rather than feared. "And I'm grateful for that," Jake said honestly. "But what you gave me isn't what I need anymore. What you need is to remember your obligations," Snake replied, his tone growing harder. "The Brotherhood doesn't exist for your convenience, Razor. We're family, and family doesn't walk away when someone better comes along." Several brothers nodded agreement, their loyalty to the Club absolute in ways that left no room for competing priorities. Jake understood their perspective because he'd shared it for 2 decades, believing that the Brotherhood was the only relationship that mattered, the only bond worth maintaining. "The woman taught me something you never could," Jake said, meeting Snake's gaze directly. "She taught me that real strength comes from protecting people who can't protect themselves, not from hurting people weaker than you." "And what happens when she decides she doesn't need protection anymore?" asked Wrench. "What happens when she gets tired of playing house with a broken-down biker and wants to go back to her real life?" The question cut deeper than Jake wanted to admit, because it touched on his own fears about Sarah's feelings. Was their connection real or just gratitude born from desperate circumstances? Would she still want him in her life once the immediate danger passed? "Then I'll deal with that when it happens," Jake said. "But I won't spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been because I was too scared to try something different." Snake stood slowly, his movement carrying the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. "You know the rules, Razor. Nobody leaves the Brotherhood and stays friendly. You walk out that door, you're on your own." Jake had enforced those same rules himself, had visited former members who'd thought they could leave the life behind and start fresh somewhere else. The Hells Angels didn't permit retirement, didn't allow brothers to simply fade away when their usefulness ended. "I understand," Jake said, removing his cut and laying it on the table with the patches that had defined his identity for 20 years. "But I'm still leaving." As he walked toward the door, Wrench called out one final time, "She better be worth it, brother." Jake paused in the doorway, thinking of Sarah's courage in facing Webb, her determination to fight back against a system designed to destroy her, her gentle strength that had somehow reached past 20 years of carefully constructed defenses. "She is," he said simply, and walked away from the only family he'd known since the war. The business license for Adaptive Motorcycle Solutions lay freshly printed on Jake's workbench, its official seal marking the beginning of something neither he nor Sarah had dared to imagine 6 months earlier. Their shared vision had taken shape slowly, born from late-night conversations about independence and mobility, about giving people with disabilities the freedom to experience the open road. Sarah's wheelchair had been transformed over the past weeks, Jake's mechanical skills combining with her engineering knowledge to create something revolutionary. The custom-built chair featured motorcycle-grade wheels, a lowered profile for better aerodynamics, and adaptive controls that would allow her to operate specialized 3-wheeled bikes designed for riders with limited mobility. "The bank approved the loan," Sarah announced, rolling into the garage with paperwork clutched in her hands. Her voice carried excitement and disbelief in equal measure. 6 months ago, she'd been a woman with no credit, no income, and no legal standing to make financial decisions. Now, she was a business owner with her own checking account and the freedom to sign contracts. Jake looked up from the motorcycle frame he'd been modifying, his hands stained with grease, but his expression bright with possibility. The garage had been transformed from a simple repair shop into something resembling a research and development facility, filled with adaptive equipment, computer-aided design stations, and prototype vehicles that pushed the boundaries of what disabled riders could achieve. "How much?" he asked, though they'd both memorized the numbers weeks ago. "Enough to build 12 adaptive bikes and rent a proper showroom in town," Sarah replied, her smile infectious. "And we're really doing this." The business had started as an accident, almost literally, when Zara had insisted on test riding one of Jake's modified bikes. Her natural engineering instincts had immediately identified improvements that could make motorcycling accessible to riders with various disabilities. What began as personal adaptations had evolved into prototypes that solved problems neither had initially recognized. Their first customer had been Maria Santos, a former police officer who'd lost her legs in a line-of-duty accident. She'd heard about their work through the Veterans Network that connected Danny to other disabled service members, and had driven 300 miles to see if motorcycle riding was still possible for someone in her situation. "I thought I'd never feel that freedom again," Maria had said after her first ride on one of their adapted bikes. "This gives me back something I thought was gone forever." Word had spread through online communities and support groups. Disabled riders who'd given up their motorcycles after accidents or illness. People who'd never thought motorcycling was possible, given their physical limitations. Each inquiry had pushed Sarah and Jake to innovate further, to solve new challenges and expand their understanding of what adaptive mobility could accomplish. "The community center called," Jake said, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "They want us to do another demonstration next month." "Apparently, the last one had a waiting list," Sarah nodded, remembering the crowd that had gathered to watch disabled riders testing their adaptive bikes. The event had been emotional for everyone involved. Families seeing possibilities they'd never imagined, riders rediscovering independence they'd thought was lost forever. "We should probably hire some help," she suggested, surveying the growing complexity of their operation. "I can handle the engineering and design work, but we're going to need people who understand customer service and business operations," Jake agreed. Though the idea of expanding beyond their small partnership felt both exciting and terrifying. For 20 years, he'd been part of an organization that discouraged trust in outsiders, that viewed growth and change as threats to security. Building a legitimate business required a completely different mindset, one based on openness and community rather than secrecy and exclusion. "Danny's interested in coming aboard," Jake mentioned casually. "Says he's tired of living like a hermit and wouldn't mind working with people again." The suggestion made perfect sense. Danny's military background gave him credibility with veteran clients. His disability provided insight into adaptive needs, and his isolation had taught him patience and attention to detail that would serve customer service well. "What about the Hells Angels?" Sarah asked quietly. "Any problems since you left?" Jake's expression darkened slightly. The Brotherhood hadn't exactly honored his resignation, though they hadn't actively interfered with his new life either. Occasional drive-bys past the garage, former brothers who'd stopped by to test his resolve, reminders that leaving the life behind wasn't as simple as turning in his cut. "Nothing I can't handle," he said, which wasn't exactly an answer but was all Sarah was going to get on the subject. She understood that some aspects of Jake's past would always remain complicated, that 20 years of Brotherhood loyalty couldn't be erased overnight. But she also saw how their business was giving him purpose beyond violence, how helping other people reclaim their mobility was healing wounds in his soul that she'd never fully understood. "We're going to change people's lives," Sarah said, studying their prototype bikes with pride. "Already have," Jake replied, looking at her rather than the motorcycles. Sarah's new wheelchair was a work of art, disguised as medical equipment. Its frame forged from lightweight motorcycle-grade aluminum and painted in deep metallic blue that caught the light like water. Jake had spent 3 months perfecting every detail, from the custom suspension that smoothed rough terrain to the integrated toolkit that reflected Sarah's hands-on approach to problem-solving. "It's beautiful," she whispered, running her hands along the chair's sleek lines. Every curve had been designed with both function and aesthetics in mind, proving that adaptive equipment didn't have to sacrifice beauty for utility. The chair looked fast even when stationary, its motorcycle heritage evident in every design element. Jake had presented it to her on the anniversary of the night he'd found her on Highway 101, exactly 1 year since their lives had intersected in ways neither could have imagined. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of them. This chair represented not dependence or limitation, but freedom and possibility. "Test it," Jake encouraged, his voice carrying the pride of a craftsman who'd poured his heart into his work. Sarah transferred into the chair with practiced grace, immediately feeling the difference Jake's engineering had made. The seat supported her perfectly, the controls fell naturally under her hands, and the entire mechanism responded to her movements with the precision of a finely tuned machine. She rolled across the garage floor, testing the chair's responsiveness and marveling at how smoothly it handled. This wasn't just mobility equipment. It was an extension of her will, a device that amplified her capabilities rather than compensating for her limitations. "The community center class is here," Danny announced from the garage entrance, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who'd found purpose in helping others. 6 new students today, including that young veteran from Sacramento. Sarah nodded, checking her appearance in the mirror Jake had installed at wheelchair height. Over the past year, their adaptive riding program had grown from a small experiment into a recognized therapy program that attracted students from across California. Each class brought new challenges and new successes, disabled riders discovering or rediscovering the joy of motorcycling. The students gathered in the parking area were a diverse group united by their shared experience of disability and their desire to push beyond perceived limitations. Maria Santos was there as always, now serving as an assistant instructor whose own transformation from despair to empowerment inspired every new rider who met her. "Before we start," Sarah addressed the group from her new wheelchair, "I want you to understand something important. This isn't about overcoming your disability or proving anything to anyone else. This is about discovering what freedom feels like when you stop letting other people define what's possible for you." The lesson began with basic bike familiarization, each student learning how their specific adaptive equipment worked and why certain modifications had been made. Sarah's engineering background allowed her to explain not just the what, but the why, helping riders understand their machines in ways that built confidence alongside skill. Jake worked with individual students, his patient instruction and gentle encouragement helping nervous riders find their courage. His own transformation was evident in these moments. The man who'd once been known for his capacity for violence now celebrated for his ability to nurture confidence in others. "Remember," he told a young woman who'd lost her right arm in a factory accident, "the bike doesn't care what you can't do. It only responds to what you can do. Focus on your strengths, not your limitations." The breakthrough moment came when David Martinez, the veteran from Sacramento who'd lost both legs to an IED, successfully completed his first solo lap around their practice course. His whoop of joy echoed across the parking area, infectious in its pure celebration of rediscovered freedom. "I thought I'd never feel like myself again," David said afterward, his eyes bright with tears he didn't try to hide. "But out there on that bike I remembered who I used to be." Sarah understood exactly what he meant. The accident that had disabled her, the years of abuse that had followed, the systematic destruction of her independence and identity, all of it had been designed to make her forget her own strength. But helping others reclaim their mobility had reminded her that strength came in many forms, and that true freedom was something that could never be taken away by others. As the class ended and students began loading their bikes for the journey home, Jake approached Sarah with something in his hands. It was small and metallic, catching the afternoon light in ways that made her heart skip. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice carrying the nervousness of a man about to risk everything on a question whose answer would define the rest of his life. Sarah looked at the ring he'd crafted from recycled motorcycle parts, its surface polished to mirror brightness, but retaining the industrial strength that had originally given it purpose. Like everything else Jake had built for her, it was beautiful and functional, traditional and revolutionary, a perfect symbol of the life they'd created together. "They told me you'd be a burden," Jake said quietly, echoing the words that had started their journey together. "Now I can't sleep without you in my arms." The wedding ring forged from motorcycle metal caught the morning light streaming through the cabin windows, its surface bearing the subtle imperfections that spoke of handcraft rather than mass production. Sarah twisted it gently on her finger, still amazed by how perfectly it fit, how naturally it felt like part of her hand after only 3 weeks of marriage. Danny's cabin had been transformed for the ceremony, its rustic interior decorated with wildflowers Sarah had gathered from the mountain meadows and motorcycle parts Jake had polished to mirror brightness. The guest book that had once recorded the stories of broken people seeking sanctuary now contained the signatures of friends who'd come to witness their union, each name representing someone whose life had been touched by their journey. "Mrs. Morrison," Jake said softly, testing the sound of her new name as he brought her coffee in the adaptive mug he'd designed for her morning routine. The title still felt strange to both of them, not because of the marriage itself, but because it represented a choice freely made rather than a legal obligation imposed by others. "I like the sound of that," Sarah replied, accepting the coffee with a smile that had become more frequent over the past year. The fear that had once shadowed her expressions had been replaced by something calmer, more confident, the peace that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. Their honeymoon had been unconventional by any standard, a motorcycle tour of adaptive riding programs they'd helped establish across 3 states. Each stop had brought reunions with former students who'd gone on to build their own communities of disabled riders, spreading the message of possibility and independence that Sarah and Jake had first discovered together. "The documentary crew wants to schedule the final interview," Jake mentioned, settling into the chair beside her with his own coffee. Something about capturing the full arc of the story. The filmmaker had approached them 6 months earlier, intrigued by their business and the broader implications of their work in the disability community. What had started as a simple profile piece had evolved into something more comprehensive, an examination of how love and purpose could transform lives in ways that traditional rehabilitation never achieved. "Are you ready for that level of attention?" Sarah asked, knowing that Jake's past with the Hells Angels made media exposure potentially complicated. "I'm ready for whatever comes," he replied with the certainty of a man who'd found something worth protecting. "Besides, the story's not really about us anymore. It's about what's possible when people stop accepting limitations others try to impose on them." The business had grown beyond their wildest projections, with adaptive motorcycle programs now operating in 12 states and international inquiries coming from countries where disability rights were just beginning to be recognized. Their success had attracted attention from major manufacturers interested in developing accessible vehicles, creating opportunities to impact thousands of lives rather than dozens. But more than the business success, it was the personal transformations they witnessed daily that gave their work meaning. Students like David Martinez, who'd gone from suicidal depression to becoming a certified instructor himself. Maria Santos, who channeled her police training into advocacy work for disabled veterans. Dozens of riders who discovered that their accidents or illnesses had ended one chapter of their lives, but didn't have to prevent them from writing new ones. "Mark's trial starts next month," Sarah said quietly, referring to news that still felt surreal despite months of legal preparation. The evidence they'd gathered had proven even more damaging than they'd hoped, exposing a network that had operated across multiple states for over a decade. Mark and his associates were facing federal charges for conspiracy, kidnapping and fraud, with sentences that would likely keep them incarcerated for years. More importantly, the publicity surrounding the case had led to policy changes that made it harder for abusers to weaponize the legal system against their victims. "Any regrets about testifying?" Jake asked, though he already knew her answer. "None," Sarah said firmly. "Every woman who comes forward makes it easier for the next one. That's worth any discomfort I might feel." Jake reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease of 2 people who'd learned to move as a unit. His own transformation was evident in the gesture. 20 years of emotional armor replaced by the vulnerability required for true intimacy. The sound of motorcycles approaching broke the peaceful morning silence, but neither of them tensed the way they once would have. These were friends arriving for their weekly group ride, disabled veterans and accident survivors who'd found family in their shared love of adaptive motorcycling. "Ready?" Jake asked, though he made no move to get up immediately. Almost, Sarah replied, savouring these quiet moments before their day filled with the joyful chaos of teaching and riding and building something larger than themselves. She thought about the woman who'd been found broken on a rain-soaked highway over a year ago, how that person would never have imagined this life was possible. But here she was, married to a man who'd proven that real strength came from protection rather than domination, running a business that changed lives daily, part of a community that celebrated capability rather than limitation. "Now I'm ready," she said, and meant it completely.